All right, here in Krita, the brush tool is right there, the shortcut for which is B, just like Photoshop. And as you've probably guessed, with the brush tool, we have access to all these brushes. Immediately, I prefer Krita's brush preview window because you can see like that's obviously a pencil brush and we can draw with it. Change the color to mimic more of a graphite pencil, and there we go. And I've already shown you that you could just right-click and access brushes through these various menus. So if I want an airbrush, there we go, and I'm painting with an airbrush now. Changing brush size in Krita is the same, square bracket keys. Or a handy little shortcut is hold Shift and drag, and you can resize your brush this way. And yet another way to do it is simply drag this slider here for various brush sizes. Although this one's not so good because you don't get a preview. I prefer the square bracket keys or the Shift key because you can literally see how big or small your brush is getting. In order to sample colors, instead of the Alt key as we saw in Photoshop, it's the Control key. And much like Photoshop, Krita gives you this previewer that shows you the new color you're sampling compared to the old color you had, and just let go of Control and you can paint with that new color. If you go back to the toolbar here, there are also some preset shapes, like this box. Looks like a selection tool, but it's not. It's a box drawer, I guess. But it'll draw that box with the brush I have active. So if I choose this pencil brush and drew a box, it'll paint it with the pencil brush as opposed to that airbrush I had previously. And the same is true for this. This is a circle one. You can make a bunch of circles. This tool here allows you to draw your own custom shape. And these tools here are the same, except these give you those curvy Bezier handles, which enables you to draw smoother shapes. And of course, you also have a line option. And this is probably the best way to get straight lines in Krita. Going back to the interface topic for a second, just like in Photoshop, we have an undo history window here. And it's the same idea. I can go back in time, scroll way up, and take away all my actions if I wanted to. But what's kind of nice about this window is it gives you little icons. Like I can see each stage of the image, so I don't have to like read what they are. I can say, oh, I want to go back to roughly that stage and just click there. Alternatively, you can simply use Ctrl-Z to undo, or click the undo or redo buttons up here. The crop tool in Krita is right there. It's pretty straightforward. You just click and drag. You can adjust these handles to get your cropping. Push enter when you're done, and there you go. The zoom tool is down here, the magnifying glass. I can click and it zooms in, or I can hold Control and click and it zooms out. You can click and draw a selection like this and it'll zoom to that selection. And remember, once again, you can right click and use the zoom feature here with this slider. And speaking of navigation, pushing spacebar will allow you to navigate like that. Or you can simply click this hand icon and it does the same thing. I never like to click the hand icon though. Spacebar is such a handy shortcut for that. Usually I'll be like on the brush tool and spacebar will allow me to move around while still having the brush tool active. The gradient tool is right here. And at the top here, you have your preset gradient patterns. Krita defaults to a transparent. And by the way, Krita also uses a checker box to indicate transparency. So the default is your color to transparent. So if I pick this bright green, I can click and drag and I have that same effect that I had in Photoshop. Of course, you could click this and pick other patterns. This one oddly doesn't respond to any color I have here, which is odd, but you can go in here, click edit, and now you can manually configure exactly how you want this gradient tool to look. This is the type of stuff you just want to play around with. But honestly, I never use that. I always use the default, which is foreground color to transparent. The shapes that the gradient takes can be adjusted at the bottom right. Change it to radial, and it's now like that circle effect. It's even got this cool reverse box, which will invert how the gradient works. That's pretty cool. And by the way, a lot of the tool's adjustments are down here versus at the top like they were in Photoshop. So if I click the paint bucket tool, I have all of its properties at the lower right. But that's just where I've put the window. I could have put that window anywhere. Okay, moving on to the selection tools. In Krita, they are down here at the bottom. This is the box selector. Make a selection. If you want to move that around, click on the move tool, which is that guy right there. Move this around. You can push Ctrl-T, just like Photoshop, to access scale tools, and we can scale freehand by default, or you can hold Shift and scale uniformly. Moving off the handle will turn it into a rotate feature. And again, just like Photoshop, you could right-click, and you have things like perspective, which allows you to warp it around. Notice you can only do one of these things at a time. Like if I were in free transform and I rotated it and then went to perspective, it resets my rotation. What you have to do is go to free rotate, do it, hit apply, then push Ctrl-T again, then go back in, hit your perspective, and you can do it this way. It's a little bit more cumbersome. Also, instead of pushing Ctrl-T, you can simply click this icon next to the move tool and it brings up the same controls. To deselect that, you can go to Select, Deselect. And by the way, while we're here, Krita also gives you the shortcut, which in this case is Control-Shift-A. There's also a Reselect option, which is pretty handy sometimes. Anyway, your other selection tools are here. You've got your circle. You can hold Shift and add more selections. You can hold Alt and take away selections, just like Photoshop. Here's your freehand one. There are also default actions down here. For example, if I click this second one and made a selection, the overlapping area will become my new selection. See that? And you have different ones you can play with, although I just usually keep it on the first one. This tool here is like the magic wand tool in Photoshop. It's called the contiguous color selector in Krita. Contiguous just means connected colors. So as I pick this white color, it'll pick all the connected white pixels. If I sample this blue color, it'll sample all the connected blue pixels. There are some interesting features down here like grow or shrink selection. Let's grow it, select a white pixel. You can see it's selected beyond the borders. This actually can come in handy often in Paint. We'll see if a situation arises where I can use that later on in this lesson when I do an actual painting in Krita. And the only other selection tool I use is this one, which gives me those Bezier handles that we saw in Photoshop. And of course, much like Photoshop, I could go to the brush tool and paint within that selection. By the way, if I zoom in here a little bit, you can soften the edges of your selections by going up to Select, Feather Selection. For some reason the window has jumped over here, but you can set the feather radius to say, let's say 13 pixels. Now when I paint into it, you can see that there's a soft edge around that selection. Photoshop has the same feature and it's basically located in the same spot. I just forgot to show it. I'll try and show it when I actually do a painting in Photoshop later in this lesson. And speaking of similarities with Photoshop, another tool you have in Krita is this eyedropper tool. We know already that it allows you to sample a color, but if you go down here to your options box, you can change this radius value to say whatever you want, 10 pixels. And now what it will do, it'll sample a radius of 10 pixels and average those colors together. This can be really handy if you have a lot of like gritty texture or speckly brushstrokes where it's unreliable just to sample a single pixel. You could also change the blending. So at 48%, which is what I just set it to there, when I sample it, it'll blend my sample 48% with my initial color. So let's choose a red color, which is the opposite of green, and sample this green. You can see that it basically moved 48% toward where that green actually is, which is way over here. To my knowledge, Photoshop doesn't have a tool like that, and I think that's a pretty interesting new development on the eyedropper tool. Okay, a couple final things I failed to mention. When you have your brush selected, you can change the opacity of your brush up here, and your foreground and background colors are located here. If you wanted to, you could choose one of them and select your color, but obviously it's much handier to just select it here, or use this handy pop-up selector here. And by the way, in this pop-up selector, your background color is kind of sneakily hidden right there. A quick way of changing it is to actually select the foreground color and then just click this arrow and swap them. Now the color I just selected for my foreground has become my background, and I can continue to select my foreground color. Most of the time though, you're probably only going to be worried about your foreground color because that's what you paint with and that's what the gradient tool uses and the paint bucket tool and so on. It's pretty rare that I'm ever worried about what my background color actually is. Okay, so that about wraps it up for the toolbar in Krita. Let's move on now to Procreate.